Headaches were frequent visitors in the home of Susan Snow from Auburn, Washington. By now, they no longer surprised her, nor did they seriously worry the 40-year-old. Susan worked as an assistant to the vice president at Puget Sound National Bank. Over the years, many clients had gotten to know her personally, respected her for her professionalism and kindness, and often requested that only she handle their accounts. But her success and popularity didn't ease the stress and pressure that came with the job. The headaches came often, though not badly enough to justify taking sick leave. Instead, Susan simply took a few tablets of over-the-counter Excedrin Extra Strength. Susan felt yet another annoying headache as she woke up on the morning of June 11, 1986. Shaking a couple of red gelatin-coated capsules out of the bottle, she swallowed them and placed the bottle back into the cabinet above the kitchen sink. The powerful medication usually eased her headaches within 15 minutes. In the meantime, she could wash up and change into her business suit. Susan's 15-year-old daughter, Haley, was also up and taking a shower before school. That morning, only Susan and Haley were at home. Susan's husband, 45-year-old Paul Webb King, was a long-haul truck driver and had already left for work. Her older daughter, 23-year-old Exer, had spent the night in the city. Haley could hear the muffled sound of running water through the bathroom wall. It was coming from her mother's room, where Susan was finishing getting ready for work. Suddenly, Haley flinched at the sound of a loud thud, like something heavy had fallen. She figured her mom might have tripped and fallen. Listening closely but hearing nothing else, she shrugged it off, assuming she was overreacting and that maybe a heavy bottle or something similar had simply dropped. After her shower, Haley was putting on makeup in front of the mirror when she realized the water was still running. Something felt wrong. She walked into her mother and stepfather's bedroom, but Susan wasn't there. The sound of rushing water still came from the bathroom. Haley called out to her mom. No answer. She peeked inside. The sink was nearly overflowing. Any more and water would have started spilling onto the floor. Susan couldn't turn it off. She was lying on her back at the base of the sink, her head awkwardly propped against the frame of the shower stall. Her eyes were wide open, fixed in place. Her skin looked unnaturally pale and tense, her face frozen in a mask of terror. She was gasping for air, like she was suffocating. Haley had never seen her mother like this. Panicked, she rushed over and tried to lift her, but Susan didn't respond. At 6:43 a.m., Haley called emergency services, and by 7 o'clock, paramedics had already arrived at the house. She assumed her mother had fallen. The medical team also initially believed Susan had hit her head, but there were no visible injuries. No cuts, bruises, swelling, or fractures. A curling iron lay near the sink, which Susan had been using, but electrocution seemed unlikely. There were no burn marks, and a shock strong enough to cause this kind of collapse would have tripped the circuit. The paramedics began checking medication bottles for signs of overdose, accidental or otherwise. But Haley was quick to explain that her mother wasn't depressed and would never harm herself. She didn't use illegal substances either. Haley mentioned that her mother had woken up with one of her usual headaches and had taken some painkillers. She brought the bottle of Excedrin from the kitchen. It contained 60 capsules originally, and only a few were missing. Susan couldn't have taken too many, and given how often she used the medication, a bad reaction seemed unlikely. With no clear understanding of what was wrong, the doctors did everything they could to help Susan, but her breathing grew more labored and her pulse weakened rapidly. A helicopter was dispatched to airlift her to a medical center. Since Susan had no history of serious health issues, doctors suspected her recurring headaches might have been signs of an undiagnosed condition, like a stroke or an aneurysm. However, none of her symptoms fully aligned with any known diagnosis. The medical team was confused and unsure how to treat her. Meanwhile, Susan's condition was deteriorating by the second. Her loved ones, husband Paul, her second ex-husband Connie Snow, with whom she remained on friendly terms, her twin sister Sarah, and her older daughter, Exer, were all notified of Susan's hospitalization. At first, none of them were overly concerned. Susan had always seemed healthy and rarely complained about her well-being, so the idea of something serious didn't cross their minds. But as they arrived at the hospital one by one, they were horrified by what they saw. Susan had slipped into a coma, and machines were the only thing keeping her alive. Doctors confirmed brain death and delivered the heartbreaking news that there was no hope for recovery. By midday, Susan Snow was gone, a seemingly healthy woman taken in a matter of hours by an unknown force. What exactly caused Susan's sudden death remained a medical mystery. Hoping for answers, her family agreed to an autopsy. At the morgue, as the pathologist made the first incision to open the chest cavity, her assistant caught a distinct smell rising from the body, the bitter scent of almonds. The assistant immediately recognized it as the telltale sign of cyanide poisoning and reported it to the pathologist. However, the pathologist couldn't detect the scent. Soon after, Susan's attending physician entered the room, also eager to learn the cause of death. And he didn't smell it either. In addition, Susan's skin was unusually pale, while cyanide victims typically show pink or bright red coloring. The assistant hesitated to press the issue, but insisted the pathologist send a blood sample for cyanide testing, a procedure not normally done during a standard autopsy. The medical examiner agreed, though she remained convinced Susan had died from natural causes, possibly cardiac arrhythmia, an irregular heartbeat that, in severe cases, can cause stroke or heart failure. But to everyone's astonishment, cyanide was found in Susan's system. The pathologist and doctor hadn't noticed it because the ability to detect the smell of cyanide is genetic. 20 to 40% of people simply lack the gene required to sense it. Had the assistant not been present during the autopsy, the cyanide that killed Susan likely would have gone undetected. In fact, her symptoms aligned perfectly with cyanide poisoning. The toxin prevents cells from absorbing oxygen, effectively suffocating the body from within. Deprived of oxygen, cells quickly begin to die, leading to dizziness, shortness of breath, coma, and, in lethal doses, cardiac arrest. Susan's fall, labored breathing, and rapid decline into unconsciousness all fit this pattern. The only anomaly was her pale skin. Cyanide victims often appear pink or red, but this isn't always the case. The pathologist informed Susan's family and the police. The cause of death was acute cyanide poisoning. It's a rare form of poisoning, most often caused by inhaling smoke during house or industrial fires. Cyanide is also found in metalwork, jewelry production, photography, pest control, and agriculture. None of these applied to Susan, nor could she have accidentally ingested a fatal amount. While trace amounts exist in certain seeds or fruits, an adult would have to consume hundreds, if not thousands, for it to be lethal. Intentional ingestion was also unlikely. Her family firmly denied any signs of depression, and Susan had clearly been preparing for a regular workday. In cases of suicide by cyanide, it's usually committed by people with lab or medical access. Susan wasn't one of them. Police arrived at her home and seized anything that could possibly contain cyanide: pesticides, chemicals, and especially the bottle of Excedrin capsules. Detectives still remembered the horror of the Chicago Tylenol murders 4 years earlier, when an unknown pharmaceutical terrorist laced capsules with cyanide, killing 7. By that evening, tests on Susan's Excedrin were complete. Of the original 60 capsules, 56 remained. 9 of them contained 4 times the lethal dose of cyanide. There were no fingerprints on the pills, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual, Susan's husband, Paul Webb King, had suspected the Excedrin long before anyone else. During the autopsy, Paul had a phone conversation with the pathologist. They discussed various possible causes of death, all of which Paul dismissed. Then, almost out of nowhere, he asked whether his wife could have died from poisoned capsules. The question caught the doctor off guard. Paul explained that Susan had taken Excedrin right before her collapse, specifically from a newly opened bottle of capsules. At the time, the pathologist brushed the idea aside, thinking it was far-fetched. But once cyanide was actually discovered in the capsules, Paul's oddly specific suspicion raised red flags. Paul claimed that earlier that morning, before leaving for work, he too had taken a dose from the same bottle to ease his arthritis symptoms. No one had witnessed this, and there were just enough missing capsules to suggest he might have taken some, or that he simply removed a few to support his story. Had Paul been unbelievably lucky to avoid death, or had he known the pills were poisoned? Detectives began to suspect the latter. Further doubts came from Susan's identical twin sister, Sarah. Like Susan, she suffered from frequent headaches, and both sisters preferred buying their painkillers in tablet form, not capsules. After the infamous Tylenol murders in Chicago, they believed tablets were harder to tamper with. So when Sarah saw a bottle of capsule-form Excedrin in her sister's home, she was shocked. She brought it up to Paul. He claimed Susan had accidentally bought capsules instead of tablets, but later discovered she preferred them. They were easier to swallow. Sarah wasn't convinced. Something about his explanation didn't sit right. Taking these facts into account, it's no surprise that the detectives began to look at Paul as a suspect, especially since the search for other possible suspects, such as the bank's clients, Susan's ex-husbands, or lovers, yielded no results. The investigators themselves noted that Paul's character lacked positive traits, and he spoke about his late wife without emotion. He made crude jokes that made others feel uncomfortable given the situation. The only time he showed any emotion was when his face flushed with anger upon realizing he was being considered a suspect. Those who knew him described him as a jealous, possessive man who only cared that his wife earned more than he did. When Paul was asked about the marriage, he said that he and his wife got along perfectly and hadn't argued since September 1985. He remembered the date precisely because that was when he confessed to being unfaithful. During a business trip, he had an affair with an ex-girlfriend named Mary. Paul claimed that after seeing a psychologist, he and Sue reconciled, and in the following months surprised everyone by announcing their engagement. They exchanged vows on Thanksgiving Day, 1985, about 7 months before Sue's death. But although Paul insisted they were getting along well, others might dispute that claim. The husband's infidelity was all Susan talked about. She kept a photo of Mary in a kitchen cabinet and even once showed the picture to her younger daughter saying, "Look at this bitch." In her notebook she wrote, "To hell with Paul. I hate Mary. I hate Paul." She thought about kicking her husband out, but couldn't bring herself to do it. The thought of losing him devastated her. It was the late Susan who was the glue holding the family together. With her gone, the family split into two factions. On one side was Paul, on the other were everyone else. From a practical standpoint, Paul wasn't the only one who could have administered the poison. As Paul rightly told Haley, she should prepare herself because she was alone with her mother at the time of death and would become the prime suspect. But it wasn't only Haley who was scared. The older daughter, Exeter, was also in town and even stopped by her mother's house the evening before her death to pick up some things. She did not stay overnight at her mother's house, but stayed at a hotel with a friend Susan couldn't stand. Right after her mother's death, Exeter gave a statement, but when asked to come to the station a second time, she showed up with a lawyer, then left after a minute and refused to speak to the police. The detectives understood that every member of Susan's family had the opportunity to poison her. They all had access to the house and no one would have aroused suspicion being in the kitchen, but only one person stood to gain financially from Sue's death. She was insured for $20,000, which Paul would have received. The man claimed he would use part of the sum to pay off credit card bills, with the remainder going to Sue's daughters. However, the girls didn't receive a single cent. When they asked him about the promised money, he replied that finances were tight. The daughters also noticed that their mother's jewelry had gone missing. Paul himself was changing before their eyes. He swapped his usual Hawaiian shirts for expensive business attire and bought a new car. He also started seeing another woman. It was as if he didn't care that his behavior was making him look more and more suspicious. Meanwhile, news about the poison capsules, of course, reached Bristol Myers Squibb, the manufacturer of Excedrin, and rumors began circulating about a copycat poisoner from Chicago. However, the police were convinced that Susan's murder was an isolated incident committed by someone she knew. Nevertheless, unwilling to take any chances, Bristol Myers recalled the capsule products nationwide. This decision cost them millions, possibly tens of millions of dollars. The product recall became sensational news. The media loudly covered Susan's murder. Customers returned Excedrin to pharmacies, and staff removed it from the shelves. All the bottles were sent for laboratory analysis, despite the police's confidence that this was a waste of time. But everything changed on June 17th when the police received a call. The woman on the line was hysterical. She spoke incoherently but managed to explain that she noticed similarities between Susan's murder, which had been in the news, and the death of her husband a week earlier. 6 days before Sue's death, on June 5, 1986, 52-year-old Bruce Nickel returned home from his job at the State Department of Transportation, where he worked as a heavy equipment operator. He arrived at 4:10 p.m. His beloved wife, 43-year-old Stella, was preparing dinner. Due to working with heavy equipment, Bruce often suffered from headaches. This day was no exception. He hoped a shower would refresh him, but the headache wouldn't simply go away, so he resorted to his usual remedy, a strong dose of Excedrin. The recommended dose was 2 capsules, but Bruce decided the medicine would work faster and be more effective if he took 4. All he had to do now was wait. Bruce went out to the backyard, where he breathed in the fresh air and admired the peaceful surroundings. After a few minutes, Stella was startled when her husband called out to her in a strange way. She found Bruce leaning against the patio doorframe. He was dizzy and on the verge of fainting. Stella helped him to the couch. Bruce tried to sit, but his legs gave way, and he collapsed onto the floor. At 5:02 p.m., Stella called emergency services and reported that her husband was having some kind of seizure. Paramedics found Bruce lying on the living room floor, unresponsive. He was gasping for air. What also disturbed the medics was the color of his skin. His body was pale, except for his head, where the skin had turned bright red. They had never seen anything like it and didn't know what it meant. While the medics attempted to revive Bruce, Stella explained that her husband was a recovering alcoholic and a heavy smoker. But considering this, he was generally quite healthy. He was not prone to anxiety attacks, fainting, or seizures. From time to time, he experienced headaches, including the one he had that day. Stella brought the painkiller package from the kitchen. The medics quickly examined it and ruled out the medicine as the cause of Bruce's condition. It was just Excedrin, which Bruce regularly took without problems. Time was critical. The man's blood pressure was dropping, and efforts to stabilize him failed. A helicopter transported him to the medical center, but despite the doctor's efforts, he died by midnight. Bruce Nichol was an adopted child. At 16, he accidentally overheard a conversation and learned the truth. Although he loved his adoptive parents deeply and was endlessly grateful to them, he was haunted by the thought that his biological mother had abandoned him. This led to trust issues that contributed to 3 failed marriages, as well as a serious alcohol addiction, which he used to numb his pain. At the same time, he was a very intelligent man, gentle, sensitive, and with a great sense of humor. But by the time he was well into his 40s, he was still hopping from bar to bar until he either passed out or got thrown out, whichever happened first. One evening at a tavern, he met an elegant, dark-haired beauty he had never seen before in town. Her name was Stella, and she didn't seem like the kind of woman someone like Bruce would attract. However, like Bruce, Stella carried her own scars, both emotional and physical. Stella was born in Oregon but remembered little of her childhood because one time her father, drunk again, kicked her mother, brothers, and sisters out of the house, shooting at them with a shotgun. Fortunately, no one was hurt, but that was the last straw for Stella's mother. She took the children and moved to Colorado. Then came 2 terrible fires. After the first, Stella needed a skin graft. The second fire resulted in the death of her little brother. At 15, Stella realized she was pregnant and confessed to her family that it was the result of abuse. On October 23, 1959, she gave birth to a girl, Cindy. Another pregnancy came when Stella was 18, but she gave that child up for adoption. She often changed relationships, homes, and jobs. Over the years, Stella built an emotional armor around herself. Those who weren't close to her found her cold, distant, and withdrawn. But those who managed to break through found warmth, humor, and passion. Her first meeting with Bruce left little impression on Stella, but a week later she ran into him on the street and saw him in a different light. He seemed smart and attractive to her. Even his alcoholism didn't repel her. She accepted it. Strange as it may sound, their romance blossomed in bars, where they spent evenings playing pool and drinking. Every weekend they enjoyed wild parties. They got married in September 1976, but within a year they faced financial difficulties, largely due to Bruce's habit of spending $250 a week on alcohol, a significant amount even by today's standards. Although they both enjoyed their alcohol-fueled lifestyle, Stella encouraged her husband to cut back on drinking, or at least drink at home, which would be safer and cheaper. But Bruce found it hard to change until one moment. In 1979, he went on a 2-week binge, missing work and rarely coming home. When Stella found him in a bar, something seemed to click in his mind. He enrolled in an addiction treatment program. Over 10 days, he underwent aversion therapy, commonly known as coding, completed the program on the 10th day, and from that moment on, Bruce never took another sip of alcohol. However, Bruce couldn't give up another bad habit. He was a heavy smoker. During the autopsy, the pathologist concluded that the man died of hypertension due to cardiopulmonary collapse caused by emphysema of the lungs. But his wife simply couldn't accept this. Her husband was healthy. Bruce had recently undergone a medical exam for work. The doctors had warned that he might develop emphysema in the future, but they had seen no signs of it at the time. Stella wondered if a lung disease could progress so quickly and fatally. Nevertheless, from a medical standpoint, the case was closed. Bruce was buried. And a week later, Susan Snow's murder made headlines everywhere. After Stella's call to the police, an officer arrived at her home. Stella opened the door. The widowed woman looked absolutely terrible. Stella had become seriously addicted to alcohol. Friends worried she would drink herself to death. Her house had turned into a dump. Even her once bright and colorful tropical fish aquariums, a source of pride, showed signs of neglect. Stella worked as a security inspector at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. She monitored X-ray machines, checking travelers' luggage before flights. She had risen to a supervisory position due to the seriousness with which she approached her job, but since her husband's death, she spent nights in bars and showed up to work in the morning, smelling strongly of alcohol. At the officer's request, Stella brought the medication Bruce had taken before his death. The bottle was almost empty, only 8 capsules remained. Stella also handed over a second bottle, still sealed in its packaging. She had purchased them at different locations about 2 weeks apart. Stella believed she bought the first bottle somewhere in Auburn and the second in Kent. Both bottles were sent for testing. Poison capsules were found in both bottles of Excedrin from the family's home. Bruce had already been buried, but a vial of his blood, taken during the autopsy, was kept at the King County Medical Examiner's office. When the police requested it be analyzed, poison was detected. Bruce had died from cyanide poisoning, so 2 people had died from acute cyanide poisoning. Yet Bruce and Susan were strangers to each other. They had nothing in common except that they both lived in Auburn, Washington. The news of the second poisoning spread fear. Investigators once again shifted the focus of the investigation. This time they were searching for a serial killer. At that point, only 2 victims were known, but the police feared there might be more. The product recall continued, and Bristol-Myers faced immeasurable damage. Paul Webb King and Stella Nickel filed lawsuits against the company. Paul expressed frustration with how the police were handling the investigation. He felt the investigators were wasting time on him when they should be looking for the real killer. Surprisingly, 3 of Paul's ex-wives came to his defense. They insisted he was not a wife killer, just someone who divorced if something in the relationship stopped working for him. Finally, when Paul passed a polygraph test, meanwhile, Bristol-Myers recalled 15,000 packages of Excedrin. And out of those 15,000, only 1 contained cyanide. The bottle was taken from the same store in Kent where Stella Nickel had bought the medication. After examining Bristol-Myers manufacturing facilities, the police concluded that cyanide could not have entered the capsules during production. Moreover, the poisoned bottles had only appeared so far in King County, Washington. Investigators narrowed their search to the store in Kent, questioning staff about disgruntled former employees or customers acting suspiciously. Then, on June 24th, another extraordinary event occurred. A bottle of maximum-strength Anisin 3, placed on top of a jar of peanuts 2 rows away from the medicine aisle, was out of place. Given the circumstances in the city, the manager handed the medication over to the FBI, and it was found that 4 capsules contained cyanide instead of painkillers. This confirmed that the poisoner was active in King County, not at the manufacturing sites of either drug. The situation was unprecedented. Washington State imposed a 90-day ban on the sale of all over-the-counter capsule medications. Pharmaceutical companies affected by the ban united and offered a $300,000 reward for the capture of the poisoner. All the bottles were sent to the FBI for analysis. No fingerprints were found on any of the capsules. The perpetrator had likely thought to wear gloves. The poisoner carefully opened the packaging along the seam and cut the safety seal around the neck of the bottle. The medicinal contents of the capsules were discarded, and instead, each capsule contained 700 milligrams of cyanide. The bottles were then placed back into their packaging, which was resealed to make it appear unopened. This was noticeable in principle, but not obvious to an unsuspecting buyer. However, the white cyanide powder was mixed with tiny green crystals. The crystals turned out to be an algicide, a substance used to destroy algae in water bodies. The product was called Algae Destroyer. These were tablets that dissolved when placed in water. An FBI agent visited several pet stores in King County, showing the staff photos of people connected to Bruce and Susan. At one store, he came across a manager who confirmed that they sold such a product, but not very often. The issue was that moisture seeped into the packaging with the tablets, causing them to harden and barely dissolve in water. Therefore, the pet store usually ordered liquid algicides. However, there was one regular customer who disliked the liquid algicide, so the store kept a stock of the tablets specifically for her. The store manager pointed to the photo of the customer, a woman with long, wavy hair. He couldn't recall her name, but knew she shopped there frequently, sometimes every week. She kept several aquariums with tropical fish at home and even shared with him her dream of someday opening her own tropical fish store. The photo he pointed to was of Stella Nickel. It turned out that Stella had crushed the cyanide salts in the same bowl or mortar where she ground the algicide tablets before throwing them into the aquarium. But if that was true, she had already gotten away with murder thanks to the initial findings of the medical examiner. The case had been closed. All she had to do now was play the role of a grieving widow and stay silent. So why call the police a week later and attract attention to herself? The answer lay in one clause of Bruce's insurance policy, which investigators nearly missed. In the event of natural death, Stella would receive about $30,000. But if he died as a result of an accident, she would get another $100,000. Death from emphysema didn't suit the greedy wife at all. So when the media started reporting about the cyanide poisoning of Susan Snow a week later, Stella hurried to claim that her husband had died under similar circumstances. Bruce had signed his accident insurance policy just 6 months before his death. However, an FBI handwriting expert concluded that it was not Bruce who signed the document, but his wife. It was easy to believe because back in 1971, Stella had already gotten into trouble for forging documents. Her cousin was supposed to stay at Stella's house for a while, so Stella gave her own address to receive benefits. However, the cousin and her husband changed their plans and moved to Texas, where the husband found a job. They told Stella that the benefits would stop, but the money kept coming. Bob, Stella's ex-husband, asked her to send the money back. Instead, she found someone to forge her sister's husband's signature and started regularly receiving $119.50. The fraud was uncovered 9 months later when her cousin visited. Stella was sentenced to 6 months in prison but was released after 4 months for good behavior. Unfortunately for her, during that time, Bob started seeing a neighbor and was ready to divorce. Furious that she was so quickly replaced, Stella began blaming her husband for everything. She claimed that the document forgery was his idea and accused him of abusing her older daughter Cindy and their mutual daughter Leah, which was, of course, untrue. When Bob mentioned that he liked the curls of the daughter, Stella cut off all of Leah's hair. She even tried to flee the state with the girls. In the end, Bob gained custody of Leah and took her away. Cindy, Stella's eldest daughter, was still a teenager at the time, but Bob couldn't take her because he was not her father. So the detectives understood that Stella had no problem with fraud and was probably not a perfect mother, but that would not help prove her guilt in the murder. The search of her home and work locker yielded nothing. Among her aquarium supplies, there wasn't even any algicide. The detectives insisted that she take a lie detector test. Reluctantly, she agreed. While the polygraph test did a great favor to Paul, Susan's husband, by clearing him as a suspect, Stella was much less fortunate. The polygraph indicated that Stella was lying. The test results were not considered evidence, so she was released home. However, the news of her failed lie detector test triggered an interesting reaction. The FBI was contacted by Cindy, Stella's 26-year-old eldest daughter. The relationship between mother and daughter teetered on the edge between love and hate. Stella was a strict mother and demanded tough discipline. In 1969, she was arrested for beating her 10-year-old daughter. Soon after, the girl left her mother's home, and in 1978, 19-year-old Cindy found out she was pregnant. But her hope that the child would bring her closer to her mother faded when Stella responded to the news with, "I'm not ready to be a grandmother." However, when Cindy needed a job, her mother rushed to help and got her hired at the same airport where she worked. Some time ago, Stella began bringing up strange topics in conversation. For example, she asked how much of a forbidden substance would cause an overdose, or wondered why people hire hitmen if they could just arrange for brake failure or a car accident instead. At first, she spoke hypothetically, but soon she slipped and revealed that Bruce was the intended victim in all her scenarios. Cindy knew that her mother's family was struggling with debt and had recently received the final notice about overdue mortgage payments. She also knew how Stella regretted that her husband had stopped drinking. Suddenly, things became boring. The couple could no longer have fun together. Bruce had become a homebody, spending evenings in front of the TV, yet he turned out to be very strong-willed. No matter how much Stella tempted him, he resisted and did not return to his unhealthy habit. Cindy believed her mother was not serious and that if necessary, she would simply divorce Bruce. But when the truth about his poisoning and Stella's failed polygraph test came out, Cindy contacted the FBI. She revealed shocking details to the agents. Her mother had approached the matter seriously, visiting the library to first research poisonous plants. In particular, she became interested in foxglove, a pretty but poisonous plant that could be easily found right near the Nickel family home. 6 months before Bruce's death, Stella collected foxglove seeds and added them to a capsule she gave her husband. The plan was clever. Bruce liked to occasionally chew on plants growing near the house. If he had been poisoned this way, everyone would have thought he ate something on his own. But Bruce complained to colleagues about stomach pain and weakness, then quickly recovered. Stella was upset that her plan had failed. The detectives hurried to the library and seized the books Stella had borrowed. Among them was a book with a telling title, Deadly Harvest, an encyclopedia of poisonous plants. She had also read about other poisons, especially cyanide. The police established this thanks to her fingerprints found all over the pages. These pieces of evidence, along with Cindy's testimony, were enough to press charges of product tampering, including 2 cases that led to death. The trial began in April 1988. Cindy became the key witness for the prosecution. She testified that she and her mother shared a locker at work. A few days before her stepfather's death, Cindy saw capsules in a container with white powder in the locker. She thought it was salt or sugar, but her mother never used it for food. After the man's death, both the container and capsules disappeared. Stella continued to deny everything. She claimed she read the books to learn about poisonous plants because she often babysat her granddaughter. She insisted her daughter had simply lied, motivated by the $300,000 reward offered by pharmaceutical companies. While she might have been partly right about Cindy's motive, it did not diminish the importance of her testimony. Cindy might have saved her stepfather's life if she had warned him or acted sooner. But now her testimony allowed investigators to connect all the events into a single story. After her husband's death, Stella faced an unpleasant surprise when the pathologist ruled Bruce's death natural. She couldn't directly tell him to keep looking for the cause. So she decided to recreate the infamous Chicago tragedy, planting bottles with poison in various stores like some sort of pharmaceutical terrorist, and waited. After Susan Snow's death, Stella had a reason to request a review of her husband's case. If Stella's motive had been to kill her husband, she would have committed the perfect crime. But her real motive was money, and she drew attention to herself. Her plan unraveled due to mistakes she made along the way. She confessed everything to her daughter, researched poisons in the library, and crushed cyanide in the same mortar as the algae treatment. But her biggest blunder was poisoning both bottles of Excedrin that she kept at home. Out of 15,000 recalled Excedrin packages, only 4 were found to contain poison, and Stella supposedly managed to buy 2 of them from different stores 2 weeks apart. The odds of that were negligible, and this was the final nail in her coffin. After 5 days of deliberation, on May 9th, the jury found Stella guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to 2 consecutive 90-year terms for product tampering that led to death, and 3 10-year terms for other tampering offenses. If she is not released early, she will be freed in 2040 at the age of 96. Investigators knew how lucky they were that cyanide was discovered during Susan's autopsy, which led to the product recall. Many more people could have died otherwise. Stella would have had no choice but to keep killing again and again, waiting for another victim and then another. She would have continued playing the role of the grieving widow, all the while knowing that the remaining bottles of poison sat on store shelves, waiting to take the life of yet another innocent victim.